Welcome to the Renew the Mind podcast, the pastor's podcast of Christ Community Church. My name is Daniel, and we're going to be having a discussion today about Neomarxism. And we're going to start by reading an essay I wrote called Neomarxism, Redeemable or Rejectable? Introduction. Much of the 20th century was marked by a prolonged and multifaceted conflict between adherents to Marxist ideology and, frankly, everybody else. Marxism had a profound impact on the world, starting with the bloody political and cultural upheavals of the 1917 Russian Revolution, followed by communist revolutions in Mongolia, China, Yugoslavia, Albania, Cuba, and Vietnam. Numerous other states across the globe adopted or had foisted upon them Marxist-Leninist forms of government. The first true international war between Marxist forces and Western democracies occurred on the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s. And while many other conflicts followed, notably the Vietnam War, open hostilities transitioned primarily into a shady chess game we now call the Cold War. In assessing the fallout of Marxist revolutions and governments in the 20th century, the death toll is truly staggering. Deaths from violent revolutions, ensuing internal political and religious persecution, mass starvation, and the perpetual lack of material and medical resources can be very conservatively estimated at above 100 million people. The fall of the Soviet Union generally marked the end of the Cold War, and for many, it marked the end of any serious threat from Marxism. Widely considered an isolated ideology, which will collapse under the weight of its failures. But we must ask the question, is that true? Has Marxist ideology truly been dealt its death blow? As we see New York on the verge of electing an openly socialist mayor, we must recognize that Marxist ideology is alive and well and is more influential in the world, our culture, and even the church than we may think, having evolved into what can be broadly called Neomarxism. In seeking to renew and conform our minds to the Word of God, to contend for the faith once and for all handed down to the saints, and to be equipped to tear down every vain philosophy that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, biblical Christians must be intentional in examining the prevailing cultural currents from a biblical worldview. This essay seeks to briefly explore the current iteration of Marxist ideology from a Christian perspective to determine whether it is redeemable or rejectable. Foundations of Neo-Marxism. In order to comprehend the neo-Marxist paradigm, we must first examine its foundation in classical Marxism, an economic theory named after the 19th century German philosopher Karl Marx. In his seminal work, The Communist Manifesto, Marx and a man named Friedrich Engels, postulated that all the world's problems could be narrowed to a single foundational sin, the private ownership of property. This private ownership of property, which is the means of all economic production, served to alienate workers from the fruits of their labor, fellowship with other people, and their own virtuous natural state. This alienation was considered the root cause of all social and personal dysfunction and dysphoria. Additionally, private ownership created an impassable gulf between the ownership class, they called the bourgeoisie, and everyone else, the proletariat. Marx and Engels' proposed solution was the violent uprising of the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie, seize the means of production, and redistribute the wealth. This redistribution was initially to be managed through state power, but later through a pure voluntarism in what they called the communist utopia, where the private ownership of property would be anathema. This economic overthrow would, in turn, undo all existing political authority, social relationships, and morality, which were seen as the outgrowths of capitalist oppression. A new social consciousness and morality would arise, which would ensure the rise and flourishing of the envisioned communist utopia. In short, they anticipated a cultural renovation coming as a result of an economic revolution. The evolution from Marxism to Neo-Marxism. As discussed in the introduction, history quickly showed these economic revolutions led to catastrophic death, widespread corruption, and long-term impoverishment of both liberty and economic prosperity. Marxist philosophers quickly began morphing the principles of Marx into new sociological, psychological, political, and anthropological theories. With economic Marxism floundering, these neo-Marxist philosophers, particularly a group known as the Frankfurt School, re-envisioned and broadened their concept of the foundational problem. Where it was once defined as the private ownership of property, it was redefined in neo-Marxism as the more general concept of any person or group possessing something that another person or group did not. The haves and the have-nots became the new bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the Frankfurt School flowed the idea that all existing systems, be they economic, social, cultural, political, or religious, all those systems served to alienate individuals from their own self-actualization and to establish and maintain the same impassable gulf between the oppressors and the oppressed. A man named Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist philosopher and politician, was instrumental in shaping this new formulation, proposing the idea of a cultural hegemony, which is the assertion that the oppressors shape cultural norms, expectations, social constructs, and even logic in order to oppress and exploit others. These two classes, oppressors and oppressed, were defined as those groups or persons who possessed anything, such as rights, experiences, privileges, opportunities, wealth, and or status, and those who did not possess the same. This transition period from Marxism to neo-Marxism marked an inversion of the main strategy for most Marxists. Where once it was a violent economic revolution that was to catalyze a cultural renovation, neo-Marxism pursues a radical cultural revolution as the catalyst for an economic reordering. Neo-Marxism, as with most things, exists on a spectrum from the violent overthrow of institutions perpetuating cultural hegemony, groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers, to societal withdrawal, seeking mental liberation from hegemonic indoctrination, groups like the Beatniks or the hippie movement. But in the West, it was a concept called the Long March through the institutions, championed by key figures like Rudi Dutschke, I can't pronounce his name, my apologies, and Herbert Marcuse that won the day. This long march is the intentional infiltration of political and cultural institutions, things like local, state, and national governments, political organizations, schools and universities, charities, media producers, and the list goes on. Infiltrate these in order to deconstruct them and reseed the broader landscape with neo-Marxist principles. And since the 1960s, the goal of capturing influential institutions has been largely accomplished and is now the dominant societal worldview. For a harrowing synopsis of this success, you can read Roger Kimball's The Long March, How the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s Changed America. Why this matters for Christians. So why should a Christian concern themselves with understanding neo-Marxism? For many, it seems like the neo-Marxist is attempting to address many of the concerns that the Christian is. Many of the societal ills we see and seek to address today seem to be biblically identified and provide potential common cause for linking arms with the neo-Marxists and seeking a solution. Corporate greed, political cronyism, institutional corruption, which usually ends up harming the poor disproportionately, and widespread economic difficulties have at least contributed to societal ills like increased drug use and suicidality, tribalism, crime, and the broadly reported experiences of dissatisfaction and depression. Why not partner with this new iteration of Marxism to alleviate suffering and establish justice? Don't we all want a utopia where everyone has enough and there is societal order born out of goodwill and common decency? Well, there is significant danger for the Christian in this attitude, as neo-Marxism is not a reformed or renewed version of classical Marxism. Rather, it is a potent fruit of a poisonous root. Consider the following: Marxism's anti-theistic foundations. Marxism is virulently antagonistic toward theism in general, but towards Christianity specifically. Marx's writings contain numerous statements about religion's inherent harm. He was contemptuous of Christianity and its God, admiring Satan as the archetype of those willing to cast off Christian religious and moral shackles. In Marx's estimation, Christianity had been institutionalized not because it was true, but as a convenient means for subjugating and deluding the poor. Blessed are the poor, and promises of rewards in the afterlife kept the masses from pursuing their own earthly satisfaction, insulating the rich and enabling them to retain and multiply wealth. Engels, Marx's compatriot and benefactor, explicitly stated that Christianity and socialism were mutually exclusive worldviews. While Engels never composed sonnets to Satan like Marx did, he hated Charles Spurgeon due to his massive influence for the gospel across Europe. Marxism's DNA is so anti-theist and anti-Christ that any truth claims generated from it or its progeny cannot be safely baptized and incorporated into a believer's or a church's life and doctrine. Rooted in covetousness. Neo-Marxism is rooted in covetousness, which some argue is the actual original sin. See Paul's example in Romans 7:7-13. It was at least part of Adam and Eve's original sin. Having been given all the trees of the garden save one, they looked upon the restricted tree as something good being denied them, and the knowledge of good and evil as something God had that they did not. The evident bitterness in Marx's writings towards those possessing wealth and privilege reveals covetousness to be Marxist philosophy's unifying value. It foments envy, ingratitude, and discontent, using them as goads to spur their version of progress. Humanity must be awakened to their dispossessed state and have their envious discontent agitated enough before the necessary revolutionary zeal can manifest. Further, woven into Neo-Marxism's DNA is the inherent wrongness of one party possessing something another doesn't. And this foundational sin is not limited to material things. Anything one party has that another lacks, even things as ethereal as mental rest in a culture, is taken as evidence that injustice is being committed. The neo-Marxist goal is to deconstruct all systems that led to this disparity. This contradicts both the Old Testament law and the New Testament ethics, which affirms the goodness of the 10th commandment and the call to lead content and peaceable lives. Anti-authority, not just anti-authoritarian. Baked into the cake of the neo-Marxist worldview is the assumption that all authority is fundamentally at odds with the individual's ability to accomplish their true goal of self-actualization. In a neo-Marxist framework, submission to just authority is not to be embraced or delighted in. Those in possession of authority are not to be trusted. Change comes from stirring agitation, undermining credibility, and prolonged disruption and resistance, with the only acceptable result being the transformation of the institution or office to the neo-Marxist position. The assumption of this approach is that there is no just authority. When authority is exercised, it is always done as a means of control and not care, oppression and not protection, subjection and not safeguarding. The entire field of critical theory and its offshoots are devoted to examining authority structures for how they perpetuate cultural hegemony in order to subvert and ultimately deconstruct them. Fundamentally, neo-Marxism's opposition to cultural hegemony puts it at direct odds with the God of the Bible, the sovereign king by whom, through whom, and for whom all things were made, and who establishes earthly authority and rules over a hegemon called the kingdom of God. Neo-Marxism calls evil what God has ordained and calls good. It promotes a false gospel. The misdiagnosis of the original sin is problematic in itself, but it reveals a more foundational problem. Neo-Marxism is at odds with the gospel in the following ways. First, it rejects God's providence in history. It assumes things like circumstances of birth, family lineage and history, immutable characteristics, and the expressions of culture across human history, with its hierarchy, social structures, political institutions, and the like, are not created, ordained by, or sustained by the providence of God. Rather, they are expressions of either the triumph of oppressors or the triumph of the oppressed in past generations. Second, it rejects the sovereignty of God in the created order, where all people are created with diverse characteristics, giftings, abilities, genetics, proclivities, leading to a broad diversity of outcomes. Neo-Marxism inherently views diversity of outcome as evidence of injustice. This is not to deny that unjust systems and injustice don't exist or affect people's outcomes, nor that there is not a Christian imperative to identify and address them. However, the intrinsic view of Marxism, its creation narrative, if you will, is that humanity in its unaffected state would have no diversity of outcome, which is not a biblically justifiable claim. Third, it misdiagnoses humanity's foundational problem. Neo-Marxism substitutes internal sin with external oppression. Sin, the rejection of God and refusal to observe his commandments, is something done volitionally within and through people against God. External oppression is something done systemically against people from without, causing the people to experience dysphoria and behave dysfunctionally. Fourth, it promotes a different Savior and a different salvation. Salvation from sin requires the Savior, Christ Jesus, and his atoning, redeeming work on the cross to reconcile the world and humanity to God. In a neo-Marxist paradigm, salvation requires humanity to come to an awareness of their dispossessed state in order to overthrow and deconstruct the external systems of oppression. In this system, the Savior, whether it is the state or the people, is humanity itself. And finally, it promotes a different restoration, where gospel restoration is characterized by all things existing in a perfect submission to God and redeemed relationships to one another. The consummation of all things in the neo-Marxist paradigm is a human utopia with an existence devoid of religion, family, government, or any other forms of authority or hierarchy. Utterly rejectable. For these reasons, and a multitude more, any Marxist thinking should be fully rejected as a worldview, and its methods resisted whenever attempts are made to use them to inform directives for life and doctrine. However, some claim that Marx made appropriate criticisms of capitalism and social ills, and thus can be useful as a tool of analysis. After all truth is God's truth. I would warn against this disposition. First, Scripture makes far better and truer critiques of capitalism and social ills than the Communist Manifesto or critical theory. Second, it is virtually impossible to immunize against the Marxist worldview. It is a kind of mind virus which infects the host, and it is a replacement worldview, complete with creation narrative, fall into sin, redemption through a Savior, and an anticipated restoration of all things. You cannot divorce its conclusions from its worldview, from its premises. Accepting the former requires, wittingly or unwittingly, embracing the latter. For the Lord of the Rings fans, it's akin to the One Ring. Many might attempt to use it for destroying evil, but will find themselves corrupted and enslaved by it. Genetic fallacy notwithstanding, some conclusions are worth rejecting simply because of the egregious nature of their genesis. Any ideology explicitly rooted in exalting itself against Christ and his kingdom deserves not only to be torn down, but its ashes are not worth sifting in an attempt to find salvageable gems. Well, guys, thanks for listening to that. That was a long one. I'm here with Pastor Jeff, Pastor Ryan, Pastor Patrick, and our pastoral assistant Josh. And I have to start by confessing this is a particular passion of mine. I tell people all the time when I see somebody holding a Nazi flag, I have a visceral response to it. I have that same visceral response when I see somebody holding a hammer and sickle or a communist flag.
Or the socialist symbol of a fist in the rose.
Yeah. So this is a little bit of a passion for me, but I do think that it has broad implications and a profound impact on the church. And so I just wanted to open up the discussion with that. How does this, we talked about why this matters for Christians and that it is promoting a different gospel. But what kind of ways do we see this infiltrate the church, or have you seen it? Just wanted to throw that out there, or what your initial thoughts were after hearing that.
I think you nailed it. It's well written, Daniel. And I think you put your finger right on it. It's right on target. And that is, we're quite literally seeing neo-Marxists. We have been seeing the neo-Marxist cultural revolution against traditionalism. It's been in swing for a while now. But now we're actually beginning to see the neo-Marxist cultural vision, which is trying to reinstate Marxist communist policy. And as we discussed before off of, I wouldn't say camera, but I would say off the audio, one of the statistics that I came across in watching the news of what's going on lately, particularly in New York, is that 14% of Gen Zers have a favorable view of Marxist communism.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable, man. And I've heard this variously, so I thought you nailed it. You set this up well, and there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I would second that as well. This is your passion. This is not my gifting. I'll be upfront about that. But just you succinctly tracing out the history of it and how we can explain some of the things that we're seeing both in the church and in the culture today is really, really helpful. And so I appreciated that. I think one thing that does jump out, I'm sure we'll discuss it more, but kind of where this anti-authority comes from, and not just an anti-authority, but a automatic presupposition that any authority is bad. And I think that, I think that even questions rooted around what is a pastor elder's authority within the church, there seems to be this presupposition that because we have a collectively an authority or a sphere of authority given to us, that there can be a presupposition that we are not good, or that is not good, or that we are not wielding it in a healthy or a good way. And so I think helping people to maybe recognize, why is there a distrust of authority? Why, have I been maybe discipled in some ways by the culture or by these larger tenets within Neomarxism? Because it is being pushed from so many different angles, but have I been potentially discipled where I have this presupposition that authority is bad, and coming to see that actually good and godly authority structures exist within Scripture. So that was helpful for me.
Yeah.
I think you do a really good job marching through, as Ryan said, the history. I love seeing the domino effect, what leads to what leads to what. And it's because I'm really interested in the fruit of an ideology, like what does it actually produce? And so you point out that the fruit here always promises higher than it ever delivers.
Yeah.
So and because of that, what it delivers is, we'll get into the basics. I mean, the majority of this, but what it delivers for me as a pastor is what Ryan articulated, is suspicion towards person in authority to take advantage of another person.
Yeah.
And so that's the fruit I see again and again whenever this domino falls.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You're talking. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You jumping in?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say I really enjoyed it as well. I think it does a great job. For me, at least, it really explains a lot of the dialogue that we see in the culture nowadays. And it really helped me to see kind of something I've been thinking about recently is like the social justice gospel and how churches have been trending towards that. And it really is rooted in a neo-Marxist worldview.
Yeah.
They're focused on the oppressed and the balancing of the scales in terms of equality on all measures. So,
and as Daniel pointed out, I mean, he asked, so why would a Christian concern themselves with understanding neo-Marxism? Like, it seems like such a at first it seems like such an academic topic. What practical purpose does it have? But you go on to say, for many, it seems like the neo-Marxist is attempting to address many of the concerns that the Christian is. And this, you highlight a legitimate problem here that Jesus himself addressed, and that is the issue of injustice, the issue of greed, all of these things that the Marxist or the neo-Marxist is trying to focus on. They do it in such an unchristian way. And then what you point out here is that all of this is just addressed better in the Christian worldview.
Yeah.
The Christian worldview just addresses it better.
And truer, like rooted to truth.
Yeah.
One of the places where we see the social justice stuff creeping into the church, and some people can't really articulate, hey, why is this a problem? Why does this feel different? Am I just being challenged in my Western capitalistic perspective, or what? And I think one of the big things that one of the large tactics that neo-Marxists use is redefining terms. They co-opt words and they insert a new definition. So if you come to somebody and you say, are you for or against justice?
Yeah.
Well, nobody in their right mind is going to go, nope, I'm against justice. I think that's bad, right? When none of us would say that. But when you start getting down into the definitions of justice and the definitions of oppressed or oppression, that's where the problem starts happening. And in our desire, there was a very famous pastor in New York who I love and will not name here, but he made the part of his way of reaching out to a very liberal city was to take the approach of, hey, God cares more about the things that you care about than you do, right? You say you care about justice. God cares more about justice than you do. And it's a great approach sometimes. It's not a wholly unbiblical approach, but what ended up happening is the people who adopted that guy's really successful strategy and really faithful, standing faithful on definitions, is that
Took it further.
The people who weren't as smart as him,
Yeah.
the people who weren't as diligently biblical as him, began to adopt the culture's terms of what justice was, right? And when that started to happen, where sin once was defined as rebellion against God and his commands, anything that goes against God's revelation in nature and in his word and his desire for humanity, sin got redefined as that which causes harm, right? And harm got redefined as anything that makes somebody not feel good about themselves. And so when you look and go, how could a church go from holding to a biblical view of marriage between one man and one woman to fully affirming and performing same-sex marriages? It's because you adopted the definitions, the cultural definitions, to say sin is anything that causes harm. Harm is anything that makes somebody feel bad. Telling, two image bearers of God who have affection and care for one another, that they can't be married causes emotional distress in them. That must be sinful then to hold a view that we can't marry these two people.
And doesn't it go back to, Daniel, you said Marxism is virulently, you and I both stumbled over that word, virulently antagonistic toward theism in general, but Christianity specifically. It is an atheistic worldview. So how in the world could it possibly be incorporated into the Christian system? This, the dilemma that you just outlined, or the picture you just drew for us, really goes back to an atheistic view of a human being.
Yeah.
That they are malleable, that they're not, that their gender, for example, their biological sex is not instantiated by God, by design and by decree. And so this Marxist or neo-Marxist cultural worldview is inherently, innately antithetical to either belief in God or following Christ's way.
Yeah. And that, that's one of the goals of the neo-Marxist is to enable people to return back to, they believe that in man's natural state, no authority, no ownership of property, nobody possessing what anybody else, that they will be, that is their fundamental good state, right? And the goal is to remove all hindrances to somebody being able to live in that natural state. And so, with the gender thing, when, gender ideology or gender theory, if you ever want to get sick to your stomach, look up a man named John Money and the experiments that he performed trying to remove the concept to divorce the concept of sex and gender, trying to show that gender is purely not, of course there are some gender things that are culturally defined, but trying to make it purely a cultural construct that was born out of neo-Marxist thinking. And the goal was, hey, gender is a restriction put upon somebody because of their sex, rather than these are God ordained, hardwired kind of things. And so the goal was to alleviate the individual of the bondage of being a particular gender. And now we're starting to see the fruit of that, where
that dude was demented. Like when you study him,
truly
demented,
truly evil. And it's one of those things where you probably shouldn't have young children involved in the discussion around what he did. It was,
but as you point out, these ideas are well springs from which the culture is just drinking.
And it is
drinking it up.
But if you to finish up that thought, so you're trying to alleviate this construct of gender, but really what you're doing is you're trying to deny the nature of man as a humanity as a sexed pairing.
Sure.
That does what? That bears the image of God in the world, right? So all of the the ideas, if you were to ask some people, they might be able to say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian Marxist or neo-Marxist or whatever, but all of the ideas, because they're born out of that anti-Christ, anti-theistic worldview, it's all working to try to deconstruct that order.
Right.
So even if you were to say, I personally hold this a Christian view and I'm a Marxist, you can do that, but you're trying to hold two completely incompatible things, because your neo-Marxist position is trying to destroy your Christianity.
Yeah.
It's trying to destroy the image of God in people, the created order. Like it just, so when I say you can't adopt the conclusion without importing the presupposition, without bringing the whole worldview to bear, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
So I think grounding this in in an everyday experience, I think a good example of the redefinition. So what's the domino effect that leads to the redefinition and then the cultural acceptance? I think we saw it put on display when Justice Amy Coney Barrett was going through her judicial approval before the Senate approval committee. I forget exactly what you call it. I'm blanking on that. But she was asked the question, because she's a Catholic, if she has any contention with someone being homosexual. And she gave a response, something to the effect of, she does not hold anybody in contempt for choosing to be attracted to male or female. To which the senator from Hawaii confronted her and says, you say it's a choice? That's wrong. It's how someone feels. And so in that moment, Amy was kind of thrown back and said, well, okay, just kind of took that definition that the senator gave. And then within the week, Webster had changed the definition in the Webster's dictionary to what the senator had affirmed. And so that's how quick it can happen. And that's how nefarious it ultimately is. You're not allowed to question it.
That is such a fantastic example. And, if you were to take 100 people off the street and ask them, how many of you are neo-Marxist? Here in Southeast Idaho, where it's fairly conservative, I bet you might get 4 people out of those 100 that say, yeah, I think neo-Marxism is good. But if you start asking questions, what has your primary indoctrination been in? Right? And if you were to start to share the tenets of neo-Marxism, they would go, oh, it's been that. Right? And the culture is very responsive to it. Like Webster changing, there's one interaction between a senator and a future justice, and all of a sudden we're changing the dictionary definition of a term. And this, to me, is one of the most important reasons why Christians need to be aware, involved, eyes opened, looking for this stuff. Because we talk about it all the time. If you are not catechizing your kids, if you are not indoctrinating your children in the faith handed down once and for all to the saints, something else is indoctrinating your children. We aren't non-indoctrinatable people. Yeah. We are.
Marxism would say the word indoctrination is wrong, so you can't even use it in the
because it talks about
the irony.
Yeah, and so one of the things that shocked me and scared me a couple years ago is I was watching Fancy Nancy, the Disney Plus show, with my daughter Clementine, and it was a lazy, afternoon, and I'm hanging out on the couch. She wants to watch a show, and she wants me to sit there and watch it, with her, and I'm just kind of mindlessly watching this thing happen. The show happen, and usually this show is pretty innocuous, and Fancy Nancy comes from a good home, and they're usually discussing pretty ethically virtuous things. But in this particular episode, Nancy's parents make a decision that Nancy disagrees with, and then Nancy goes to her friends in the neighborhood and starts sharing her perspective of what happened and what's going on. And by the end of the episode, they are in her parents' driveway with protest signs, marching, talking about how we're going to withhold our, no hugs and kisses. We're going to withhold our affection until we get justice for this particular topic. And it was, it wasn't like they were trying to, human traffic or something like that. It was something really small and innocuous. I can't remember specifically what it was, but
something that you almost missed it.
Yes, but in the end, her parents, in response to this protest, they compromise with Nancy, and then all of her friends and Nancy cheer, and it's all great
because she won.
And I walked away thinking like, oh, it's silly, blah, blah, blah. And then an hour later, this crushing realization landed on me. What was the meta narrative that this show was teaching my daughter? Right?
Blessing and a curse for you.
Well, yeah. Don't go to the movies with
Seriously,
me. It won't be fun afterwards. Right? The meta narrative that was being taught was disagree with the decision that a God-ordained authority has made. A good one, too, because her parents throughout the rest of the show are always depicted as being very just, good parents. So disagree with the decision of a God-ordained authority, seek redress for that authority. When denied the redress that you want, it is not cheerfully submit to the just authority. It is agitate discontent amongst your peers, right? Create a grassroots movement, protest and disrupt until the just authority changes. That's what was being taught to my little daughter about how to affect change and about how to interact with just authority.
So my curiosity then would be, the writers of that show, are they even aware of what they were put forward, or
And-
are they so indoctrinated that that's just acceptable?
And I would argue that if you were to go to the writers of Fancy Nancy and say, "Hey, are you neo-Marxist?" They would go,
say no.
"No, we're children's show writers."
Yeah.
But they came up through
Yeah.
the university system.
Mm-hmm.
They've lived in a media culture that is dominated by neo-Marxist values. They are, in order to get their stuff on air, it has to align with the neo-Marxist values, because again, it's about reseeding the landscape with these principles. And so this is just the water that they have been swimming in, and so they're just reproducing it, and they're just continuing to replicate it. And that was part of the goal of that long march, right? And especially the infiltration of the academy, which Jeff can probably speak to better than any of us.
Now it's the Christian Academy. Now it's seeped into Christian universities, such that Christians are beginning to think about starting new universities the way we did at the turn of the last century with the battles between the increasingly liberalized divinity schools like Harvard and Chicago and the rest,
Undermine scripture.
and Boston. And so many of our Christian universities were actually started, some of the ones that we went to were actually started in protest against that increasing liberalization, theological liberalization. And now we're seeing those biblical, formerly biblical, solid, theologically solid institutions are now beginning to be swayed.
And I have a theory as to why this is. When this long march happened, the only significant resistance that it found was from either the general morality of Christianity, right? So the society was primarily Christian, whether they were attending church, regenerate believers is a different story. But this, the society had
Christian ethic.
had basically been, Christianized, and so it met broad resistance just in general in the culture, and so you get pictures in movies and of the young, hippie anti-war guy in a fight with his parents over the Vietnam War kind of thing, and so it met it broadly in the culture there. And it met it in the church, in the evangelical church, primarily. So the main lines adopted it, but they had already, the precursor to that had been them going with the liberalism.
Yeah.
And so the church was the last holdout of this long march, and has been the last holdout of this long march, which is one of the reasons why I think there is such an animosity in those institutions towards the evangelical church, because they didn't infiltrate. But when you get the opportunity to start redefining terms that are important to evangelicals, like justice, care for the poor,
well, biblical terms, these are terms the Old Testament prophets, read Isaiah chapter 1, he very much cares about the project of justice. But, and Jesus very much spoke about the disenfranchised and the marginalized. I mean, he lived in a top-down world, starting with Rome, and then also embodied in the Sanhedrin, which was the Supreme Court, and also the highest legislation branch of Israel at the time. So, there was real oppression. There was real oppression in the Old Testament and in the New Testament that Christians lived under. Christians lived under the oppression. But as you say, the solution is a Christian solution, which is not to abolish all authority. It's not to abolish all rule or godly order.
Yeah, and it's to keep those categories correct.
Yeah.
And when you see movements like in 2020, there would be a lot of movements for justice who were openly advocating for neo-Marxist worldview stuff, but then they would use like Micah 6:8 to say, Christian, you have an imperative to do justly, right? And so all of a sudden you go,
Your regular churchgoer is confused.
yeah, I do have an imperative to do justly. What's the definition of just? Is it a biblical category that you're maintaining?
Yeah.
Or are you importing justice is this, the neo-Marxist definition? And the goalposts move constantly.
Yeah.
So justice, what neo-Marxists advocated as justice in the 1960s and 70s, it has broadened to incorporate a huge variety of new things in the
Identity
1980s, 90s, 2000, 2010s.
And I'd say that what you're describing is the weapon of our warfare is biblical literacy.
Yes.
Know what God has to say and what he means definitively. So going back to the example of Justice Barrett, when she was confronted by the senator, and she's a Catholic, but I don't think she has the biblical literacy and the conviction, because in that moment, she recoiled from her statement and adopted hers. But to those who are biblically literate and confessional and believe it, would have opposed right back to say that's not what God defines it as.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. That's a great point, Patrick. But earlier, Daniel, you were talking about how the goal of this movement is to like revert man back to the natural state, right? And if you take away these things that are oppressing or the inhibitors, then he or she will be able to live in that state kind of peacefully. Well, it ties in with your third diagnosis here concerning humanity's foundational problem. It's this assumption of the problem is from without, not within. There's no understanding biblically of the sinful flesh within us. It's these structures from without. It's these things that are done to me. There's no owning of sin. So I wanted to say that in light of discussion. But two, I think part of the goal of this podcast and what you're tying in with biblical literacy is that Christians have to know that their worldview is the best. I have no qualms in saying that, and it is true, and then therefore being able to tear down these strongholds, because the huge irony in this, right underneath you're promoting a different consummation here, where this utopia that's devoid of religion, family, government, or any other forms of authority, that's just another religion. It's just another worldview, right?
Yeah.
And so like you have to understand that these things are structured packages that come together. And so, yeah, those are just two things I wanted to throw out there.
Just for clarification, what Amy Coney Barrett said is she, in answer to the question about sexual orientation, was, I have never discriminated on the basis of sexual preference and would not ever discriminate on the basis of sexual preference. And they lost their minds that she didn't use the word orientation, but later she apologized for that. She actually apologized for using the word preference, but she was right. The word orientation is wrong. And what was on display there were two drastic worldviews. One was a preference for sin, and the other one was the belief that this person just is oriented this way because that's their chosen identity.
Yeah.
And their chosen identity is grounded in materialism.
Yeah.
Because there is no source beyond them that determines who and what they are.
And even if you were to say, okay, this is a sexual orientation, which I am not saying, but I'm saying even if you were to grant that, there's no concept of God's providence in wiring you that way and calling you to live in a certain fashion. There's no concept. It is only no.
If he wired me this way, then,
any restriction upon the individual's self-actualization is fundamentally oppressive.
And it's because the self, as we talked about with the Carl Trueman book a couple years ago, the self has now become the source, the decisive arbiter of what is true, instead of an external lawgiver who tells me who and what I am and what I'm made for. And that seems to be, going back to your paper here, you note the problem of socialism. In fact, you bring up the fact that there's a candidate in New York right now who is claiming to be a democratic socialist and is quite proud of it. Quite proud of it.
This is his platform.
And I think in a private moment, if you were to ask him, especially based on his father's teaching, who his father is a professor, a Marxist, a straight up Marxist professor, not even neo-Marxist, but if you were to ask him in a private moment in an honest way, I think he would say, yeah, I'm a proud communist. I'm a proud neo-Marxist. But you mentioned socialism here. What is the difference, if you could explain to people, between socialism and communism? Because I've always seen those two as being, like socialism says, hey, let's share what's ours. And communism says nothing is yours. You don't have anything.
And then we will share it for you.
And then we'll share it for you.
And socialism is the transitional step between capitalism and the communist utopia.
Yeah.
And so the socialists, now again, the redefinition of language and the shifting of the goalposts is part of the strategy, right? Because
Right.
and so somebody's gonna have a problem with what I articulate here. But in general, Marx envisioned that this redistribution of wealth would occur, and the initial savior, the initial agent of salvation in that redistribution would be the state, right? The state would take ownership of the means of production in order to ensure its equal and equitable, redistribution.
Right.
So socialism is the concept of the government taking larger and larger control over the means of production in order to distribute out to the people who need it.
Yeah.
But ultimately that's a transitional step, and the required deconstruction of authority, and hierarchy and distinction, really, so that people will embrace the communist vision and then live out of that voluntarily.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So Marx proposed that in the communist utopia, everybody would have what they needed because everybody would be contributing voluntarily to the needs of everybody else.
Well, let's talk historically then, because I think your distinction there is correct. I think socialism is just enough Marxism, just enough communism to allow you to keep a little, but also centralize the means of production, centralize the economy, and centralize the means of distribution to the rest. Whereas communism, clearly, the end goal in the Marxist theory, as you've laid out, is a classless, stateless position where nobody owns anything. The government owns it, distributes it to you, and then you just become this magical, productive person in this overly productive society. But historically, if you could speak to what did actually happen, because that seems like fairyland.
What happened is what happens whenever a communist government came into power. Once somebody gets that level of power, they don't want to voluntarily give it up. So there was never the transition from the state managing the redistribution to that pure voluntarism.
Sure.
And it ended up insulating people like Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot. Like it ended up providing them cover. So what happens is not that the individual. So on an individual level, so the corruption becomes obscene, and then on the individual level, there is no incentive actually to work. Man's intrinsic incentive to work, to have bread,
exactly,
to produce crops, right? It actually robs us of that vocation that God has given us.
Okay, I'm gonna make my statement here, and then you react to it.
Okay.
My thesis is that the Marxist communist economy always has a worker shortage problem, because Marxist economies always need the thing they cannot provide. They need younger workers, productive workers, to keep the system running. But then when the government takes control of everything, people stop having children, people stop having incentive to innovate. It's what Margaret Thatcher so famously said, socialism and communism is equal poverty for all.
Yeah.
And there just isn't any incentive, like we saw with the USSR, for anyone to show up and put in a productive day's work because, one, they're guaranteed a job in that system. Two, they don't have to compete for a job in that system. And three, when you take away the free market out of the market, the freedom out of the market, there's no innovation. Can you think of any product that the USSR ever produced that any of us ever wanted to buy? Never. They didn't export anything but gas and oil.
But then if there is going to be production that does happen, so things where they did really well on would be like rocket engines. That's crazy. I know it's very precise, but that's because there's corruption associated
And
with
nuclear
Why
bombs.
do you know about
And-
that?
it. So,
Well,
because
and-
I
and-
nerd out on weird things.
And they got a significant portion of the German rocket engineers after that.
For
Yeah,
sure they
right.
do. But corruption is what seeded the ground for innovation. Because going back to your point, Jeff, if there's no incentive, nothing's going to happen. So then people had to figure out a way around the non-incentive structure with an incentive.
Well, 100%. It's not just incentive. Well, without the incentive structure, you're absolutely right. You don't have a feedback loop from the market. The market cannot tell you that something isn't working. So you can't actually produce a better widget because there's no feedback system in the market. There's the people who are purchasing the products are required to purchase the products, whether it's insurance, whether it's health insurance, whatever it is. And then you can't improve it. It's the same old thing like with the post office system. Look, if you work for the United States Post Office System, we love you. We're glad you're part of our church. But the fact of the matter is that there are you have lots of competition in the marketplace for delivery. And Amazon and UPS and FedEx, they're competitive systems, and you see what you get in a competitive system versus a government-run, government-control system that is all top-down and redistributed. You get a better system in the market because there's this feedback loop. It's like, remember the old story in communist USSR? The kids don't remember this, but you guys are, I think a couple of you are old enough to remember this, where they had the shoe factory incident, and Peter Zion tells this story, which I think is so funny. They had the shoe factory was told to produce a certain weight of shoe, and so they just produced these super heavy, clunky shoes that no one could wear. And it was killing them, killing their feet, and no one wanted to buy them. And you could never export a product like that because the market could never give you the feedback. This thing sucks. This thing is terrible. You should make a better product.
And you actually made a great point about there's no incentive to have children.
Yeah.
Right. There's no incentive
Exactly.
to not just
Fulfill the
produce
creation mandate.
things.
Yeah.
There's no incentive to produce people, which led to what happened in Romania when the communist dictator there instituted a policy that women under the age of 45 had to have 5 children or be on their way to having 5 children.
No kidding.
Right. And because
Was that
we
to
need-
correct?
we need a workforce
Right.
to do this.
Dude, that is going on in Russia right now. In Russia right now for the last 15 years, Putin has been on a tear. They have re-educated their people, try to go on this mass re-education program that families are good, having big families are good. He's running out of people,
Yeah.
and he's known that for 20 years.
But what ended up happening in Romania was we have 5 children and we can't feed them because we're all living in poverty.
Yeah.
So then the state, and this to me is the most sinister part, is that the state becomes functionally God.
Yeah.
They can do whatever they want, right? If we receive our daily bread from the hand of God's providence, and now I'm receiving daily bread from the hand of the state, which denies the existence of God, who's God? The state.
Yeah.
The state is God.
Exactly.
So in Romania, you've got these impoverished families, and if you don't, and if you can't prove that you're on your way to 5 kids, your daily rations are getting cut and
Right.
all this stuff. So they went and they said, "Hey, we can't take care of all these children." And so Ceausescu said, "I am the great father of this nation. Give your children to the state." And so by the time the Romanian Revolution happened in 1989, and Western media and charities were able to actually enter the country after a 10-year total blackout from the country. They discovered in this country of 8 million people, they had an orphan population between 300,000 on the low end and like 1 million on the top end. They don't know officially because records were terrible, but also because the Western aid forces came in and felt so heartbroken for these kids that they just started taking them out of the country. And they found warehouses filled with children teenagers who couldn't speak properly because they'd never been taught, babies who wouldn't cry because they knew that I'm not going to get picked up or no aid's going to come to me if I cry out. These just absolutely atrocious conditions that they were living in. But it was because there is no natural incentive to fulfill the creation mandate. And so then the government has to enforce that. God has to come in.
That's a great example.
And that to me is the largest danger.
It's evil.
Ultimately.
And it's evil.
Yeah, is that the state becomes God.
Takes God's place.
If there is no God over the state becomes God.
I think one of the things we worry about in our country is the individual being God. So instead of like ancient Greece, which had 10 or 12, about a dozen gods in the pantheon, today we have 360 million gods, self-gods. And I think there always is a pendulum swinging effect when you've had a culture that has had a cult of individualism like that for so long. There seems to me right now to be this neo-Marxist socialist pendulum swing where people are wanting to swing back over to maybe I need a nanny state. Maybe we do need
and that's
a
actually,
state God.
That was the point that I was going to make is, go ahead.
No, I was going to make the same point that as everyone is an individual God unto themselves, there comes a place where they realize nothing is happening for me. I need something else to help get my agenda, problem across, and so they
isn't
unify
that just
towards
a
the government.
hunger for the something that
It absolutely
transcends
is.
me?
Yeah.
It's something bigger
Right.
than me to be a part of it, and I can attest to its authority and draw on it in order to see something.
And as Daniel
accomplished.
just pointed out, a federalized, centralized government that then takes on the role of God is just such a terrible tyrant, just such a terrible false god.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, if you were to ask just the commoner on the street in Idaho Falls, not commoner like kings and commoners,
Peasants,
like just the average citizen,
The average peasant.
you would say, you would ask them, hey, are you a neo-Marxist? Do you believe that the state should function as this godlike redistributive thing? Everybody would say no. But then when something happens, how often have you heard somebody say they should really do something about this?
Who's they?
Who's they? Usually it's the state,
Right.
Yeah.
and they're making an appeal to God for justice in that, right? Like,
Yep.
and so just that attitude of they should really do this, and it does. The individualism breaks down because individuals have such limited agency,
Right.
and then they will start to make their appeal to the higher authorities,
Yeah.
which isn't necessarily bad. But what ends up happening is you end up ceding all power
Yeah.
to those higher authorities.
It's a savior complex, right? You have all these individual, got 300 million and something, like you just said, who want to be the authority to themselves, but then want to cede and be saved by that higher authority. That's the transcendent crying out.
Right.
Yeah.
And they look to the state, and they want to give them the power to do that.
Where we have the true worldview of there is an ultimate authority
Right.
that holds all these other authorities accountable, and we get to make our appeal to him for justice.
Yep.
And work within the system that he has created and ordained in order to see human flourishing. And so
And I want to go to that, and I want to ask you about that, because as I read your paper here, great essay, and I've read the longer version too. It's super good, but it just occurred to me, and I just wrote this note down in the margin here. ultimately, this system, because you contrasted it, you said first it rejects God's providence. Second, it rejects the sovereignty of God over the created order. And I think you're right, it does all these things. Third, it misdiagnoses humanity's foundational problem. The foundational problem on this view is external to me, not internal to me. Fourth, it promotes a different savior, which we were just talking about. And finally, it promotes a different consummation. I thought that was very interesting. On this view, Daniel, it seems like there is no ultimate eschatology that is not materialist and hopeless and nihilistic.
100%.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree.
There just is no salvation. There's nothing ultimately to hope in. There's no ultimate purpose to live for other than the sort of provincial interests of me having my needs met and having a hopefully a better shoe than a super heavy shoe that I can't you can't clonk around
and
in.
do you know where you see this tremendously? In architecture. If you go
Soviet architecture.
Dude, yeah,
It's the
if you go
blandest bland ever.
if you go to Western Europe, even in former Soviet countries,
Oh yeah.
the architecture that was produced out of the Christian worldview that most of those countries held was
Stunning.
lovely. It was beautiful. It made the skyline of the city delightful and
Right.
engaging. And Soviet architecture is the most depressing. Like, you drive through the streets of Bucharest, and Bucharest used to be called the Paris of the East, right? And you see these little spots where there are these stunning buildings, just absolutely incredible. But for blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks, it are these Soviet era concrete
Yeah.
drab, massive,
Right.
massive building,
Right.
and you just feel depressed, and you
Right.
feel like this is meaningless. If someone were to drop a bomb on this, no big
cares?
loss to
Yeah.
no
Right.
to the architectural world, not the the human.
So you're saying it's like Idaho and Utah housing with less money?
But honestly, I think drive through the numbered streets,
Yeah.
drive through the new construction, and tell me which is a delight to the soul and which isn't.
Right.
And the numbered streets were built. A lot of it was built before the rise of the neo-Marxist worldview in our society, in our culture, and most of the rest of it was built after. And you go, even what hits your eyes here is communicating something about the meaningless end state of all things. Go buy this giant cookie cutter house that brings no real. I mean, Kristen's gonna love me for this. The gray thing, everything just being gray.
Like
It's
prison
agreeable
gray.
gray.
Agreeable gray sheets, gray flooring,
Right.
light gray on the walls. Like, all of that is
I'm wearing a gray T-shirt, so I feel called out. But
I have
Because
a
you
gray shirt
can't-
on too.
you can't divorce
Father, forgive me my neo-Marxist sin.
you can't divorce worldview, right, from what that worldview produces. You just you can't. And so if you believe that
Was that architecture? I have a question for you about that, because I've thought about that as well. Is that architecture a system? Is that just a product of the fact that they just aren't bringing enough money from a free market to even invest in those kind of ornate, Gothic, beautiful structures? Or two, is that an intentional system of depressing people or keeping them under your finger? Because we want to imagine that the original Leninist revolutions and all of this had these altruistic motives. But in reality, these were tyrants. These were people who wanted to rule by fear. You mentioned fear, but these were people who wanted to rule by fear. And so is this, even the architecture a way of depressing them? I think of North Korea right now, where everybody's starved just so much. Like, everybody's so starved, they have just enough food to think about the next meal, but they don't have enough food to think about what else might I do with my life. that's not what the government prescribes.
Yeah, I think it's a both and. I think especially the Soviet stuff was a rejection of the opulence of the Russian aristocracy.
Because that's what the
Hermitage
revolution
is
was
beautiful,
based on.
and
Yeah, and so, but there's also that thing of, hey, any distinction is innately oppressive, and so you all have to have something that looks the same.
uniformity.
Otherwise, you're going to be embracing some sense of betterness. Right? If your apartment looks better than your neighbor's, you're gonna have some superiority,
Yeah.
some hierarchy over that. So everything must be the same. Otherwise, it's an anti-communist goal. And so I think some of it, they could have picked a different look.
No, that makes sense.
Right. But so I
Totally.
think the look was a rejection of some of the opulence of the aristocracy. But the principle of it all being bland and looking the same.
That makes total
That
sense.
is that's a fundamental goal is that sameness.
In these states, I mentioned fear. People are controlled by fear. I mean, we're talking secret police, we're talking gulags, we're talking, getting hauled off to Siberia and disappearing forever in the salt mines or whatever they do there. So they do rule by fear. So what is the alternative here in the Judeo-Christian view for a God, an actual God, who runs the universe, who is sovereign over it, but whom we're supposed to also fear? Because the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom and knowledge.
Yeah.
So how have they sort of replaced it with a false fear of the transcendent?
Yeah. Well, we were talking about, the Soviet Russia is like the pinnacle picture of an attempted communist utopia.
Quintessential.
But we have gulags here. Cancel culture is the gulag.
Right.
You say something that goes against the predominant value of the culture,
You
and
get canceled.
You get canceled. Now, thankfully,
And that's both right and left try to do the same thing. A godless right still tries to cancel.
yeah. Oh yeah.
predict.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Even the people on the I'm totally anti-Marxist. You go, well, you're acting like one.
Right.
You're acting like a Marxist. So, and the fear thing is, you rule by fear, and some of that fear is because there is no. I'm trying to remember who was it. Was it Kevin DeYoung at the Together for the Gospel Conference who was talking about justification?
Yeah.
There's no justification in this system.
Right. What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
You can never truly be forgiven.
Oh.
Right? You can never truly be forgiven.
Yeah.
And they always find ways to make you unforgivable. So whether it is talking about concepts like whiteness or, male like, I can't be forgiven for being a man.
Right.
The only thing I can do.
Oh, well, you can't be forgiven for being a white man.
Well, and so the only thing that I can do then is to live my entire life in service to these neo-Marxist principles.
It's
with the
perpetual
hope-
genuflection.
Yeah, with the hope that someday maybe my children will be free.
Oh,
of
you don't
this
even
burden.
have that hope.
So there's no sense. So there's no sense of justification, which leaves you living perpetually in fear from
Being canceled, being ostracized.
or from the government or from this group or from right. There's nothing that you can do to be justified
It's
in these
only a
systems.
system that stigmatizes. It's never a system that redeems. There is no redemption in this worldview.
Yeah, and so our fear before God is because of his holiness. We are to fear God because he is holy and we are not. And he has provided a means of true justification. Not, this is one of my favorite passages in the Bible in 1 John where it says, to all those who believed, he gave them the right to be called children of God. Not the pity to be, secondhand citizens in his household. His justification is so complete that you've been given the right to be called a child of God, and now my appeal is to my Father,
Right.
right, and to my older brother who has
Right.
given me his righteousness, and my Father looks upon me and says, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased,"
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
just like he did with Jesus. That does not exist in the neo-Marxist worldview,
Right.
right? And
It's utterly unredemptive.
And so it is a fear-based system. There's never a peace that you will ever be able
Right.
to rest in that system, which is why when somebody says, this is a great example, I am not a racist, but are you anti-racist? It's not good enough to not be racist. You have to now be this other thing. Well, you can't be anti-racist. Why? Because you are an inheritor of the oppressive
Privilege,
system of
yeah.
whiteness,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? And so now you must spend the rest of your life
Making up for it.
trying to make justification for yourself by your anti-racism, by your whatever it is. Does racism exist? Absolutely, it does.
Yeah.
Is there a biblical category for racism?
Prejudice, yeah, sure.
For ethnic prejudice? Absolutely, there is.
Yeah.
And there's forgiveness for that, and there's transformation for that,
Mhm.
right? There's being brought into rightness before God and sanctification and reconciliation with people, and that doesn't exist in the neo-Marxist system.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. One other issue I wanted to bring up was just it seems like what is inherent to this movement is kind of a revolution. You get your way through constant, perpetual, unending revolution, no matter who's in power. And my thesis is revolution is actually a consistent, like perpetual revolution is really bad for stable countries and economies. Sometimes it is necessary, like the American Revolution, in order to establish something that is just. But perpetual revolution against the man or the system or whatever it is bad for nation states. It's bad for economies. And this revolutionary spirit of modern neo-Marxism actually works against genuine reform. It's kind of like if you look at your house.
Yeah.
You know, you come to your house and you go, man, the bones are good, right? Like the wiring is good. There's so much good about this house. I think I'm just going to burn it to the ground and start over, you know. Ironically, it is actually an anti-progress movement. It claims to be progressive, but it's actually regressive because it doesn't want to reform the good, you know, the bad and keep the good. It just wants to incinerate it and start over with this new vision, but you always have to do that because no matter who's in power, they become the new oppressors, right?
Yeah, the children eat the parents in every iteration of this.
Yeah.
There's nothing that can be built that's lasting.
Right.
I've always thought of like economic communism. I would just like it's a return to feudalism in some ways of the Middle Ages where you have one hierarchy and everyone else serving them as peasants.
The serfdom.
But then, the serfdom. But then in cultural Marxism, it's almost the same. It's cultural feudalism in that there's one arbiter who's at the top and we all serve whoever that is, whoever got elected in that position. So it's new days, old demons. I mean, to drive a point home.
Yeah,
nothing new
right.
under the sun.
Yeah.
And so how do we face this? How do we actually undo the cultural Marxism?
I
that
think
we
you could
face?
show that in the United States, the arc of history is bending toward justice, bending toward freedom,
Yeah.
bending toward opportunity, and bending toward, you know, I just saw a thing last night. I was watching this thing. It might have been on Netflix, and I was grading papers, and I just wanted something on in the background because I was so tired of watching football. So there was this show about Ed Sullivan, and it was just kind of a documentary on Ed Sullivan. And I thought, I don't know much about him. I kind of remember my parents talking about him. I've seen a few clips, and I just wanted to watch it. Well, it turns out that Ed Sullivan was a pivotal figure in promoting black artists. When, you know, blacks at the time would say, I never saw a black person on TV ever. The only black people you saw on TV were people in blackface, like Amos and Andy. Mm-hmm. And so here's this guy who's promoting these colored artists, as they call them at the time, and it was great. Actually, he did a great service to the nation. And so as I just kind of was thinking about our conversation today, I was thinking, man, it seems today like the world that they lived in just in the 1940s and 50s when TV was invented seems so foreign. It seemed unimaginable that they lived in that world. today. And so I think we could say, man, the arc of history is bending toward justice. It's bending toward opportunity, toward freedom. That doesn't mean that the system doesn't need more reform, because sinners run it.
Yeah.
And sinners always sin, especially unredeemed, unsaved ones. So we were always looking to make it better. But this notion that we somehow have to burn it down and create this whole new system, I feel like that's what we're pushing back against. Like what they're going through in New York right now. It feels like they've got a candidate who kind of just wants to knock it to dust and rebuild it
But he's got
the
the vibes.
socialist image.
He's displaying all the vibes,
Yeah.
which is what we really care about.
And I
wanna
think-
focus on.
I think there's two things that you mentioned. One, the American Revolution, and we can get down the rabbit hole on this, so I'm not going to go down there. But the American Revolution was actually incredibly submitted to authority the whole time until the very end, when they said, okay, you have exhausted our ability to make any appeal for
Right.
to the higher authorities. It wasn't, some of it wasn't even, hey, we got an answer we didn't like. It was, you've made it impossible for us to speak, to make redress to the just authority.
Right.
You've inhibited our ability to do that. And in doing so, you have absolved our covenantal obligation to you.
Right.
And so when they were saying their Declaration of Independence, they were saying,
It was a divorce document.
you have absolved the covenant. You are not our sovereign. And so we're going to act accordingly.
Yeah.
Not, we don't want you to be our sovereign. They had tried time and time again to enable that to happen. And so
Kind of like the Reformation.
yeah, and so there was a different attitude with that. And in First Peter, when Peter says to these Christians who are experiencing the injustice of what we would see now as religious persecution being an unjust thing, the UN would recognize it, like all that stuff. Which, never mind, I was about to make a post-mill joke, but so we see that. But what did Peter tell those Christians to do? Submit to every earthly authority. And 300 years later, the authority that was persecuting them had been transformed to them, right? They had the Roman Empire had been Christianized, and so we do it totally differently.
Yeah.
The call is a totally different call. Yes, there are times where revolution, like divorce, in case like where it has to happen because we live in a fallen world, and no authority is ultimate except for God. But the default position is to be submitted to the authority and to live in such a fashion that those things are converted, right?
Right.
In the next passage, I think in the next chapter, Peter's talking to wives of unbelievers. Live in such a way that your husband might be won without a word.
Exactly.
Not go, have a revolution in your
home.
in your home or your relationship. No, go live in such a way that without a word, your husband might be converted.
But isn't the problem here, though, because I agree with everything you just said, but is that we're talking about a system that believes in perpetual, never-ending revolution, where revolution is the very instrument, it's the very means by which a person asserts themselves or gets ahead, and it just is never ending. There's no end to it. That's why I say it's a non-eschatological system. It doesn't have an end game.
Yeah, it does not have. It has an end game that is never attainable.
Right.
Right. It will never be reached. There is no instrument by which you could do it effectively. And the I lost my train of thought on that. But we've been talking for
Do you guys think less of me that I think my family was loyalists during the revolution? Is that okay that I was a loyalist?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Dude, that's the thing. I admire even those people who are saying no. Like this would be a
You
violation.
mean your actual
of God's-
ancestors?
Yeah, if we trace it back, we're
Yeah,
not
well,
a part
we're-
of the sons and daughters
well,
of the
hold
revolution
on.
because we've been expunged from the family record.
We're all Reformed here, and the original Reformers wanted to stay Catholic.
yeah.
They thought of themselves as Catholic Reformers, and many of the Reformers actually did. John Huss, many of them did. Molina, there were lots of Catholic Reformers that never left Catholicism. So sometimes revolution is necessary. Sometimes the divorce is just necessary,
Right.
even though we want to. That's because your family were probably English, weren't they? Or Irish?
Yeah,
English,
and
Irish?
this goes back. We came over on the Mayflower, or part of
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
So I was
That's
OGs.
cool.
Brag much?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
All I heard was
Yeah.
loyalist, so
But
scratch
this-
that out of my book.
Ryan's out.
But before we end,
Don't judge me.
this is important because it shapes so much of our thinking. We are so influenced by it. If you want a rundown of the neo-Marxist propaganda in The Last Jedi, come talk to me. But it is everywhere in our culture. It's everywhere in our teaching paradigms. I mean, it like everything. And it affects the way that we actually engage in relationship with one another. And we, inside the church as well, the neo-Marxist tactic of, hey, I'm going to build a faction and agitate discontent until I get enough critical mass that I can start getting redress for my concern.
Right.
As brothers and sisters in Christ, that we're called to go in humility to somebody with our problem before we talk to our neighbor about it, right? Before we ours is we go directly to the person, not we go to a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
Now sometimes
That's great.
that doesn't work, and Matthew 18 principle kicks in. We say, hey, now bring somebody else. Now go to the higher authority. Now, but the Marxist principle would be no, you mull over it, you stir your own revolutionary zeal until you can stir it in other people, and then that's when it surfaces. So it affects the way that we do it in our relationships, personally and as a church and in the community. And so it is another reason why this matters for the Christian to have a larger understanding of the neo-Marxist worldview that pervades our culture, so that we might live in such a fashion that does please the Lord and is in accordance with biblical truth, and then build stuff from that instead of...
Yeah, this has practical application in our homes, churches, and just in our relationships. And I thank you, Daniel. Thank you for writing this. We're going to post it on our website, christotelic.faith, later today. You can check that out and read. Daniel will have his short form article, and we'll also do the long form article as well, if you want to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty details. And then next time we'll talk about critical race theory, and specifically race relationships.
Josh, any final thoughts?
All right. Well, we love you guys, and we'll
Love
see
you
you
guys.
soon.
See you guys.
Bye.